Hi everyone, and welcome to the QDU Academy session for Year 9, Round 4. This session will be addressing the long prep topic that votes should be inversely proportional to age. So in terms of the overview of what we'll be going through today, we'll be going through some points you should consider for debate context, then some things that you might need to include in setup, then some ideas to brainstorm points around, and finally, we'll go through trade-offs and how you can use these in this debate and in all other debates to strengthen your case. So first off, in terms of context, I think it's important to note that obviously the political system and voters, and specifically voter behavior, are obviously quite popular topics all year round. However, notice how age has now started emerging as an important topic within this conversation. I think this has become particularly true, especially as certain topics within the political debate have emerged and become more popular. These include things like different rights for different groups, things like discrimination policy for both ageism as well as lots of other different types of discrimination, things like climate change, all of these topics which are highly likely to have very different and polarizing opinions, and these different opinions are likely to belong to different groups as a result, perhaps, of the different sorts of experiences or priorities these different age groups have. Obviously, we cannot categorize everyone of the same age into one opinion category, but I think it's important to consider the different sorts of opinions broadly that these different age groups might have as a result of their positions within society. So in terms of the other things to consider for context, the main questions that we want to try address is have a think about why this was set as a topic. Most of the topics that you will come across will be set as topics because there are valid ideas and valid arguments to be made from either side, because this is a controversial issue where there is no real right answer. So then also consider what is the problem that this topic is trying to address. More minutely, try and answer these questions. What is the cause of the problem? What are the effects of the problem? And what is the scale of the problem? Particularly with this last question, note that a more severe problem will justify a more drastic solution. However, it will increase your burden as an affirmative team if you set up a very large problem, because obviously larger problems are more difficult to solve. Briefly though, before we jump into the rest of this topic, I think it's important to understand generally the foundations of Australian politics and understand the status quo in Australian politics as it is today in terms of how our parties work, the main platforms they are campaigning on, and how we might see some divides in terms of the voter bases that they are catering to. So, first off, what is the purpose of voting? I think this is something that is important to address as a piece of your foundational understanding the way this debate works, even if it is not explicitly elucidated within your case. So, I think we can generally identify one of the main purposes of voting as being democratic expression. So people deserve to have a say in how they are ruled and on the policies which will obviously have significant impacts on their life. What sorts of issues does our government decide? I think we can broadly categorize these into two things. So things like policy, where they are instituting certain changes, where they are taking fiscal action, spending on certain areas, taxing certain groups of people, so on and so forth. One of the other big issues that our government decides, or at least our government can facilitate the people's expression in deciding, are things like rights as well. Have a think about whether your side believes that they are going to improve either of these two things, or perhaps both of these two things. Then also consider, and this is something that might dictate your research a little bit, the distinct features of the Australian political system compared to overseas political systems like the US or the UK or any other country. So first off, note that we have compulsory voting. This means that the entire population, those on the electoral roll must vote, otherwise they will be given a fine, which obviously the majority of people do not really want. The other big feature of the Australian system that is a little bit different from overseas systems is that we have preferential voting. This means that you will order the candidates or the parties that you want to be elected to Parliament, and if your first preference party does not have enough votes to get into power, then your vote will be assigned to your second preference, and so on and so forth. The benefits of this is that it ensures that your vote still has meaning, even if you choose to vote for a party that is not very electorally successful, but it obviously also has its downfalls. The other thing to also note is generally our political system is considered a two-party system because we have two big parties that are in power. Most elections are really a fight between these two parties. However, it is also important to note that we do have a lot of independent bodies that make up our crossbench. Their power, however, is very different from that of a ruling party, which would be elected into power. So then, let's have a think about the problem. I think there are a wide variety of different problems which can be identified within the topic, and a lot of these problems are kind of rooted in the types of policy that are made by the government. Here are a couple of general policy areas that I think it is important to consider. These include things like climate change, welfare and taxation, and how this feeds into their spending rights, healthcare, refugees and immigration, education, so on and so forth. Note that this is obviously not an exhaustive list. There are lots of different things that you can think about, and that would be very strategic to bring up as the affirmative or the negative within this debate. Now let's take a look at setup. So, in terms of approaching setup, there is first off one big question that we want to answer. What type of debate is this? Is it policy or is it empirical? And so, what sort of setup does this debate actually require then from the affirmative or negative? Regardless of that, the first thing we need to do, however, is definitions. So have a think about what the keywords which you need to define within the topic are. We might broadly say that you might want to define votes and also inversely proportional. So inversely proportional, for anyone that doesn't know, just means that as one thing increases, the other thing will decrease. So as your age increases, the weight of your vote will decrease. So hopefully you have noted that this is a policy topic. What this means is that the affirmative teams require a model and the negative teams may choose to have a counter model if they would like. So the affirmative team requires a model. The key goal of this model is to provide the details that the topic does not provide. So some of the questions that you might try and answer with the model include, at what age does the worth of someone's vote start decreasing? How much does it decrease by? Have an idea regarding some proportions at different ages. This does not need to be incredibly detailed, but you want to have somewhat of a vague idea so you're able to reference this within your arguments and also reference this within your rebuttal as well. Negative teams may choose to include a countermodel or otherwise argue for the status quo as the best option. So have a think about what the status quo looks like. Are there any, or if you choose to have a countermodel and you admit that there is to some extent a problem that exists within the status quo, have a think about whether there are any other ways to solve this problem that differ from the method that the affirmative team is using. Now moving on to brainstorming points. So I think this is a debate where it is very useful to have a think about the vast different types of stakeholders that exist within the debate. So have a think about how you could answer these questions. Who are the key groups that are affected by this topic? What are their motivations? How will this interact with the policy implemented? Note that the points that are given here on this slide are not conclusive or exhaustive. You may decide to characterize these stakeholders differently depending on what you want to argue, on what side you are on. So in terms of seniors, some of the issues that they may be likely to care about are things like welfare, if they are dependent on the pension, taxation, particularly if they have large amounts of savings or otherwise investments that they are now reliant on because they may not be working or have an actual income, or else healthcare as well. Obviously, with old age, you are more prone to illness and disease, so they might be particularly dependent on healthcare or otherwise like aged care facilities. Remember that it is also very important to explain why they are particularly likely to care about these issues. So those sorts of reasonings in terms of they are likely to have illness because they are old, or they are likely to be dependent on the pension if they are not working, are particularly important. Also, have a think about whether they are a powerful group in society and whether they are over or underrepresented by voting. This might be things like thinking about whether they have a lot of financial power or whether they have a lot of social influence as a group, and also whether they are, in terms of whether they're over or underrepresented by voting, you might want to have a think about the amount of influence that the government has on their lives and whether this is proportional to the amount of the voting population that they represent. Obviously, people under the ages of 18 cannot vote, so it might be important to consider who might best represent their interests and whether, for example, people that are of like a old age are willing to consider their welfare when they are voting, or whether they would consider other things before this. Another group that you may want to characterize are youths, and particularly the groups that you think will have a very big impact on the voting system that you want to construct. So the issues that they might be likely to care about are things like climate change, whether you get policy that is like banning fossil fuels and incentivizing renewables, social movements, and also education. Have a think about why these things might be true. We might broadly say things like a lot of the younger population are likely to be in university or tertiary education and are likely to care about these things, or otherwise that they are most of our youths are like very involved in things like the treatment of minority groups, so on and so forth, and they are very passionate about these issues. They care about climate change because they are stuck on this earth for quite a while. They'll be living for a long time, so they care about things that happen 70 years in the future. Again, note that these are kind of generalizations. Make sure that like this is not to say that all youths will behave in a certain way or care about these certain issues, but you can make broad characterizations based on the things you want to argue. The other thing, obviously, to consider again is whether they are a powerful group in society and whether the government has a significant impact on their lives, perhaps more so than any other age group. Then another group you may want to think about are the middle-aged. Some issues that they might be likely to care about, particularly as working adults with new families, might be things like education, particularly for young children, taxation, and also working rights. Finally, another group that you may want to think of that is not quite the voting population, but the people that the voting population choose to represent them are politicians. So, do seniors and youths vote in the same ways? How might the ideas of a senior versus a youth differ in terms of what a trustworthy, votable politician differ? Apart from that, how might politicians try to appeal to each group? Are parties likely to change their campaign strategies, or else who they select to represent their parties in each electorate based on this policy? For example, consider whether, with this sudden change in policy, whether parties might want to appeal more to youths and the sorts of people and the sorts of policies they are likely to champion compared to the status quo. The other key clashes that you may want to consider are first off policy. So, what sorts of policy do people in each age bracket vote for? What policies are we likely to see more of? What policies are we likely to see less of? Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Another thing also is enfranchisement, or else how much trust you feel in a system and how willing you are to be engaged within a system, such as the political system of Australia. So, how does each group's interactions with the political system change? Are people within each group likely to feel more or less as though they are being represented by the government? How does this affect their future voting and their trust within the government and their willingness to rely on the government or else do things like give money to the government to fund their activities through taxation? So that brings us to the end of brainstorming points. The final thing I'd like to address is trade-offs. So a trade-off is when you argue at the end of a point or an issue that your impact is ultimately more important than a different impact that is achieved by the opposition. So this is to say that you are willing to trade off a certain stakeholder or a certain impact or benefit or harm for another impact, benefit, harm, or stakeholder. So, for example, why you think saving 10 children is more important than saving 100 puppies, why you are willing to trade off that 100 puppies for 10 children. So, trade-offs are particularly important in debates where the benefits of each team likely will not overlap. This is to say that, for example, in this debate, the affirmative team may choose to care more about youths and young people, and the negative team may choose to care more about old people. So, some of the metrics by which you can prove that one impact is more important than another is by talking about the number of people affected. So, we probably care about affecting more people. We probably care, assuming that the impact is the same, about an impact that impacts 100 people instead of 10 people. Another thing also is the severity of the effect. So, if we are talking about a slight inconvenience to someone versus death for another person, we probably care about the slightly larger impact. Finally, also, is the vulnerability of the stakeholder. Consider whether your stakeholder can protect themselves or whether this harm will plunge them into further disadvantage and take them down a slippery slope. Do you think young people are particularly vulnerable? Maybe they are poor, maybe they are likely to be financially vulnerable and very dependent on certain groups or like government welfare, or maybe they are insulated by the fact that they have parents that they can be dependent on and the system is really well developed at this point. Do you really care about old people? Are they highly dependent on the government to implement good policies to ensure they are not abused in aged care facilities and to ensure that they have enough welfare to survive even without an income? Or do you think that they have a lot of power within society because they have significant amounts of income from having worked for 80 years and now being retired with multiple investment homes? Obviously, not all people in one age bracket are going to be exactly the same, but it is important to be able to talk about the structural reasons why the majority of people within a certain group are one way or another, vulnerable or not. So, the final note here is that you should try and win a debate on multiple grounds. However, trade-offs are very, very useful, particularly towards the end of a debate, if you think the opposition is doing really well on a particular issue or on a particular stakeholder. This is also, note that trade-offs can also be made preemptively in like first speaker speeches using within the points. If you think that you are highly unlikely to win a particular stakeholder or a particular issue, but you think the opposition has a particularly convincing argument within that area. So have a think about what the opposition is likely to argue and how you can try and insulate your case from any attacks they might make. Finally, note that we have lots of other resources on the Queensland Debating Union YouTube page. I highly recommend that you get subscribed and turn on your notifications for the page and take a look at the other resources that we have for constructing different types of points and addressing different types of topics. Anyway, at the end of this, thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys all have a fantastic time at your debates.